Hey everyone, so we've got an interesting question today which will kind of annoy some of my old critics, and you'll see why when we get to it. But today's question comes from Nord, Mr. Nord, who says, Hi, I've been following TIK for some time and I've finally become a member of the core level to start with. Great work. I have been reading a Swedish writer, Christer Bergström, for some years. Christer has written 28 books about World War II. I was surprised to see some of his statements about the Eastern Front that I would like you to comment. Some of them I'm sure you have covered, but some things may be of interest. I'll give you the link and write the headings if that's okay. Keep up the good work. So I'm going to put the link in the description so you can read the article along with us. And he's listed 9 points here, but we're just going to go into the video itself. I won't read them out for now. So we're looking at this article from History Extra. So, Operation Barbarossa, 9 popular myths busted. It says the German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on the 22nd of June 1941, was the largest military operation in history, born out of Hitler's desire to conquer the Soviet territories and defeat Bolshevism. Operation Barbarossa was part of Hitler's racial fantasy of establishing Lebensraum, living space, in the East. The operation pitted two utterly opposed armed forces against one another: the Wehrmacht, the world's most advanced military force, supposedly, and the downtrodden and humiliated Soviet armed forces, most of which had little military education. The ultimate failure of German troops to defeat Soviet forces in the campaign signalled a crucial turning point in the Second World War. Christer Bergström dispels many myths surrounding the campaign. Here, writing for History Extra, he explores 9 of the most popular misconceptions. I just want to point out, because Mr. Nord did say that Bergström had written 28 books. I've actually got one of his books, which is Black Star, Red Star. I forget exactly the title of the book, but basically it's about the air forces on the Eastern Front. It's volume 3. I need to get a volume 4 for the rest of Stalingrad, and have been using it for Stalingrad. He's also written a book late 2019 on the Battle of Arnhem, which I haven't read because that's only a couple of months back that it came out, but it looks interesting, so hopefully he's added to the discussion. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out. So here's some of Mr. Christer Bergström's points. So point number 1, Stalin's collapse. In his famous speech on the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev said, "After the first severe disaster and defeat at the front, Stalin thought that this was the end." In one of his speeches in those days, he said, "All that Lenin created we have lost forever." After this, Stalin, for a long time, ceased to do anything whatever. Thanks to this statement, the idea of Stalin slipping into a state of paralysation in the early days of the campaign has transferred into one of the most long-standing misunderstandings surrounding Operation Barbarossa. However, according to research by Stephen Mayne of the University of Edinburgh into Stalin's appointments diaries, this quote was nothing but disinformation on behalf of Khrushchev. Mayne shows that Stalin's official working day on the 22nd of June 1941 began at 05:45 am and ended at 4:45. On the 23rd of June, when the Soviet dictator was supposed to have suffered from his collapse, he worked for 22 hours and 35 minutes, which is a long day even by my standards. Following such an exhausting day, Stalin's shortest working day was the 24th of June, lasting a little over 5 hours. And yeah, that makes sense. When you do a long shift, we need a day off. This might be the nucleus of Khrushchev's allegations. So in reality, it's actually the opposite, according to what Christer and Mayne are saying, that Stalin exhausted himself from working, not, I collapsed because of the German invasion. That's not what he did. He collapsed because he worked too much. However, from the 25th and 26th of June, Stalin held 24 hours of meetings. On 27th of June, according to Mayne, his recorded working days ran to a little over 10 hours, and possibly as a result of his This physical and mental punishing schedule, his working day for the 28th of June, again lasted a little over 5 hours, right? So it's not because, the Germans invaded, it is because he worked too much. Thus far from ceasing to do anything whatsoever, Stalin worked for 168 hours during the entire week of the 22nd to 28th of June. This is also backed up by other sources, such as Robert Service. He says this as well. And there's other historians as well who've commented on Stalin's so-called collapse. And it does seem that it is, I won't say necessarily misinformation or whatever, but perhaps Khrushchev had something role in it, whatever. But I agree with this point. So Nord's question about, do I agree with this? Well, I agree with this point anyway. Number 2, mass surrenders by Soviet soldiers. The German attack began on the 22nd of June 1941. I'm laughing because I know what's coming. By the 11th of July 1941, the Germans had taken more than 400,000 prisoners of war on the Eastern Front. However, contrary to popular belief, there never were any mass surrenders. Owing to Stalin's orders that the troops remain in place, large units were enveloped, but most of the multitude of isolated units fought on stubbornly until running out of ammunition, and that's backed up by the German sources. At the Brest fortress on the border in the west, a small garrison held out against an enemy wildly superior in troops and artillery, don't use the word superior, inflicting more than 1,000 casualties on the German 45th Infantry Division, the superior German 45th Infantry Division. The enemy is fighting with the utmost stamina and courage, Heeresgruppe Mitte, Army Group Centre, reported to the German High Command on the 22nd of June. German 4th Army described the Soviet soldiers as exceptionally tough and stalwart. White emerges, I'm not sure how you say that, who had fled Russia after the October Revolution, were used to try to convince the encircled Red Army troops to surrender and join the anti-Bolshevik side, but this was categorically refused, according to the German Army report. Another German account reads, "What has become of the Russian of 1914-17 who ran away or approached us with his hands in the air when the firestorm reached its peak? Now he remains in his bunker and forces us to burn him out. He prefers to be scorched in his tank, and his airmen continue firing at us even when their own aircraft is set ablaze. What has become of the Russian? Ideology has changed him." True. You see this in the Stalingrad campaign. You know, the ideology was used to stand their ground. Not a single step back, right? The Soviets are really ideologically driven to defend the motherland, defend socialism, Marxism, blah, blah, blah. And so they're not surrendering like this. They are surrendering, but only in isolated groups once their ammunition runs out. And so we can talk about why they decided to get surrendered and that is surrounded and whatever with Stalin. But yeah, you see this in 1942 as well. They're resisting stubbornly. The main problem, at least from Stalin's perspective, and possibly from our perspective as well, is that the commanders of the units were retreating or not very good, and so getting the units destroyed. There's also Stalin's repeated attack mentality, which it's not just Stalin, it's his high command as well, but that leads to horrendous casualties and then in the end encirclements and destruction of the army. So it's not necessarily the fault of the troops, right? It's not because an individual soldier was a coward and just surrendered. No, it's because they were put in pretty much an impossible situation, but they fought on regardless of that, and then when they ran out of ammunition or whatever, then that's when they surrendered. But they surrendered in isolated groups, not huge encirclements like we would hear in some of the accounts. So let's carry on. Master Spies. So I agree with that point. Master Spy Sorge contribute to the alleged relocation of the Soviet Far Eastern armies that are supposed to have saved Moscow. In preparation for this, I read Moscow by David Starhill. I read some of David Glance's books, like When Titans Clashed again, and there's other ones as well, I forget off the top of my head. And this point is 100% true. It is often said that back on the 14th of September 1941, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, had informed Stalin that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union until Moscow was captured by the Germans. It is commonly asserted that this information saved Moscow, in the sense that it allowed the Red Army to release large numbers of troops, often depicted as well-equipped and highly trained, from the Russian Far East to Moscow. But this must be dismissed as a myth based purely on speculation. What the spy actually found out was that Japan would not attack the Soviet Union unless the USSR transfers troops on a large scale from the east. In fact, no more than 3 divisions were dispatched from the Far East to Moscow during the whole period, October-December 1941. The 32nd and 78th Rifle Divisions and the 58th Tank Division. 2 more divisions, the 93rd Rifle and 82nd Mechanized, arrived from the Trans-Baikal Military District, and 3, the 18th and 20th Mountain Cavalry Divisions, and the 238th Rifle Division came from the Central Asia Military District. These were just 8 out of hundreds of divisions employed by the Red Army along the front on the 1st of December 1941. So, a handful of units. I'm not sure if it was Glantz or Starhill. One of them, I think it was Starhill, was saying that a lot of the divisions that came to the Moscow area were actually from the Stalingrad area or the Volga area. So not necessarily Stalingrad, but that's where they were coming from. That sort of area. And it wasn't really actually the Far East where they were coming from. Obviously some were, but not all of them. So again, pretty interesting. And I do agree with that because, the divisions didn't get deployed there, so it makes sense. It makes sense. The wearing down of the Wehrmacht through relentless Soviet counterattacks. I know what's coming. It is often said that one of the main reasons the Germans were defeated by the Soviet Union in the Battle of Moscow in December 1941 is the worn-out state of their forces. Indeed, in late November 1941, the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front was a mere shadow of what it had been 5 months previously. Losses had brought the strength of the army and Luftwaffe units to 30 or 40% or even less of their original strength. The veteran frontline Lancer were badly affected by battle fatigue after months of incessant combat, and you hear that if you read, what's his name? War Without Garlands is the book. I forget the guy's name. Robert Kershaw. Yeah, Robert Kershaw, I think it is. And also there's other accounts where Hitler and the High Command and all those other people who were like on the German side and the officer corps were getting stressed out. And you see how many sick and exhausted people there are on the German side. A lot of their casualties were actually, in fact, battle fatigue, stress, as it just says here. And you see the strain, and which is why by the time you get to like December time, instead of having like Halder or whatever in August going, we've won the war, now it's like, oh, we're exhausted. They can't. The stress of the battle has worn them all down, which is why when Hitler says no, you can't retreat from the Moscow area, it actually does save, to some extent, saves the entire army at that point, because if he had, it could have just disintegrated in a sense. Debatable, but we'll see. But yeah, I agree with that part. And then he says, however, the Red Army was in a far more worn down state. Yeah, its armies were in tatters after taking huge losses in the double envelopment battles at Vyazma and Bryansk in October 1941. Divisions were down to a couple of thousand men, often completely untrained recruits, and all kind of equipment was lacking. In fact, while the Germans were able to increase their tank strength on the Eastern Front between September and December 1941, again, you don't hear that, the Soviet tank forces were cut in half. This brings us to the next myth. Right, so, yeah, absolutely agreed with this. Glantz makes the point of saying in When Titans Classic, it's just like, yeah, all these divisions are just useless. There's pages of quotes with him just saying, yeah, the Soviet armies are in tatters, and the tank strength on the Eastern Front did increase. Well, I'm not sure if it did increase, but it wasn't as bad as, they were still receiving reinforcements. It's just, could they actually run them? Did they have the oil to run them? Right? And that goes to the oil thing, which some people still, to this day, are dismissing. No, that's not really the case. They had plenty of oil. Right, here we go. The point we've all been waiting for. Actually, there's another one. The vast numerical superiority by the Soviets. I'm just all the triggered people in the comment section now. Nazi propaganda nurtured the image of Germans fighting against innumerable masses from the East. But this is just racial propaganda. He's saying this, I'm not saying that, he is saying that, although I agree. But he is saying this, okay, I'm just reading it out, don't shoot the messenger. But he's able to say Nazi propaganda and it is racial propaganda, racist propaganda. Okay. In actual fact, the war on the Eastern Front in 1941 was characterized by a Soviet inferiority in pure numbers. 22nd of June 1941, the 4 Soviet Western military districts between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea had 2.3 million men, opposed to nearly 4.5 million Axis troops. Really? Is that something that I said at some point? I think it was. The Wehrmacht had also amassed 3.35 million troops. 3.35 million troops. To this, the Romanian army contributed 600,000, and then later, like over 1 million at some point in 1942. And in the north, Finland had already mobilized its army and could muster 530,000 men. I didn't realize there was actually that many with the Finns, but yes, okay. When the Red Army counterattacked at Moscow in December 1941, the Soviet numerical inferiority was even larger. Soviet strength returns in archives show that on the 1st of December 1941, the Soviets were able to muster 576,500 soldiers and 574 tanks against German Army Group Center, which at the time had between 1.9 and 1.2 million troops with 1,800 tanks and assault guns, which they couldn't run because they'd run out of oil. So anyway, the Germans. So it's not, you know, when we say it's vast, when we say one side or another has total superiority in this case, it's not quite as clear cut in that. But in terms of numbers, yes, it is, right? The Germans not only enjoyed a threefold numerical superiority in tanks, which they couldn't operate, but the Soviets tanks employed against them at Moscow, only around 30% were T-34s or KVs, which I've covered in last week's video. I said about the Panzer II, etc. You know, because people can't. When I said in my Stalingrad videos, oh, half of the Soviet tanks were T-34s or medium tanks or whatever, and the rest were light tanks, I had people complaining, yeah, but most of the German tanks were light tanks, okay? No, that's not, I mean, I was looking specifically at 1942, but people were like, well, the Panzer II, and again, no, it turns out something like 20% of the tanks were Panzer IIs. Most of the German tanks were actually medium tanks. And so, yeah. And a lot of the Soviet light tanks are terrible. People are like, no, the T-70 is amazing. Like, no, stop. Just no, right? And that's what he says here. The remainder were completely obsolete tankettes, which, yeah, for the most part. T-26s. Most of them are T-26s in 1941, and they are terrible tanks. So terrible, in fact, when I was at Tank Fest a couple of years back, I was at the T-26 section, and people walked past it and went, what's that? I don't know. I just carried on walking. It's like, it's the most produced, I think it's the most produced tank up to that point. What's that? I don't even know what it is. But yeah, so I agree with this. As the war continued, the Germans gradually lost their numerical superiority. Oh no, there's going to be people in the comment section crying. Which reflects the greater Soviet industrial capacity. But their most brilliant victories in 1941 were achieved with a convincing numerical superiority. I said this a couple of years back. And so, I'm just going to skip the next one. I'll come back to the number 6. I'm just going to go to the next one, number 7, because this, yeah. The vast differences in troop casualties between the two sides on the Eastern Front. Over the years, an image has prevailed of the differences in losses between the two warring sides during Operation Barbarossa as being something exceptional. It is not uncommon to see totally unsupported claims of a difference between Soviet and German losses as 10 to 1 or even 20 to 1. I said this, and I had all the people, no, nobody claims that. Well, here's another historian saying, yes, people are claiming this, and I'm not the only one saying it. And when I was, we'll keep going. A closer study, however, reveals that this is just another myth, probably based on German accounts coloured by racist prejudices. Yeah. A comparison between the loss relations during Operation Barbarossa and the German Western campaign in 1940 shows that the Germans actually inflicted higher losses on their Western enemies in relation to their own losses than they did to the Red Army. The relation between total casualties were 19 to 1 in favour of the Germans during the Western campaign, and between 3.2 to 1 and 4.8 to 1 in favour of the Germans and their allies during Operation Barbarossa. Even if the prisoners of war of Germany's opponents are discounted, the ratios are still not better for the Germans on the Eastern Front. 2.3 to 1 in favour of the Germans during the Western campaign, and between 1.9 to 1 and 2.4 to 1 in favour of the Germans and their allies during Operation Barbarossa. Now, I forget the exact numbers that I used. I can't remember. I think 2.4 was probably one of them. But I don't remember exactly what the numbers were. But I was coming out with something similar like this when I did my your myth of the Eastern Front, your perception of the Eastern Front is wrong, and then the numbers say it all. I forget the rest of the title of that video. But Operation Barbarossa, yeah, no, the numbers say it all. It's not, the Germans weren't outnumbered by like hordes of Soviet troops. That's not what actually happened. And I showed this and I went through the numbers and I came out with something, I can't remember exactly, something similar to this. This apparently made Nigel Askey, a historian, spit his coffee out, oh no, and write an article refuting what I said. Well, hold on. We got another historian saying the same thing. Right? Now, there is a patron who's asked about if I can respond to the Nigel Askey argument, and I will at some point. I've just been distracted by other more important issues. Let's not go there. But I've been distracted by those more important issues than responding to Nigel Askey, whose own argument makes no sense. If you just look at the raw numbers, it's not supported. But anyway, so I will reply to that. But the point is, like, oh no, TIK's lying, and my enemies, my critics have said, well, see, Nigel Askey wrote an article refuting TIK, so therefore nothing that TIK says is correct, right? Because that's how logic works. Well, no, we've actually got another historian saying the same thing. And not only that, I mean, it's not like I made it up. The raw statistics show what I said to be true. And we've got another historian saying the same thing. So is Nigel Askey going to spit his coffee out again? I don't know. I'll be interested to hear what he thinks about this and about Christer Bergström. Will he criticise him as well? I don't know, but we'll see. But I will respond to Nigel Askey at some point. But the point is, I wanted to look at both of these because this is exactly what I said in those videos. And I've been showing, as the war progressed, that Germans did end up having, the Soviets did end up getting loads of numbers and whatever else, but they didn't have it at the start. And at the beginning, they didn't have, the Germans had numerical superiority. And it was only roughly at the time of Moscow, once the counterattack gets going, that there's a shift. I'm going off the top of my head here. Then early 1942, the ratio wasn't too bad, but everything seemed to be focused on Moscow, so that's when the Germans struck south. They struck against the weakest part of the front, in a sense, and that's why they were able to break through. But then, at Stalingrad, as we will see during the Stalingrad campaign, Battlestorm Stalingrad, the Soviets just start sending all their reinforcements south. Well, not all of them, but you get it. A good number of their reinforcements south in preparation to slow the Germans down, then in preparation for Operation Uranus, which counterattacks. And it's only really at that point that the Germans really fully 100% lose numerical superiority. And it's, by 1943, then, okay, yeah, they're getting outnumbered. And that is also why they are no longer able, like their blitzkrieg doesn't work anymore. Because in 1941, the Germans had a load of tanks. They had 88mm guns. They had a superiority in terms of equipment. For that sense, most of their tanks were medium tanks, whereas most of the Soviet tanks were not medium tanks. all that other stuff, and they had experience. By 1943, the Soviets have recovered from their 1941, sudden strike, surprise attack, which they weren't expecting during Operation Barbarossa, which does destroy their army in the West. And then they've recovered by mid-1943, and suddenly now the Blitzkrieg doesn't work as well. Weird, right? Their units in 1941, even into 1942, the Soviet units were not equipped with enough anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns, so on and so forth. They're basically just, riflemen and anti-tank rifles, which is just silly. They're lacking in, all the heavy equipment. But by 1943, or even late 1942, this has changed. They're now getting equipped properly. And even in 1943, a lot of the Soviet tanks are still light tanks, but the point is it's changed in 1943. And so suddenly now the Blitzkrieg isn't able to work. Why? Oh, it's because there's millions of them. No, it's actually because the Germans no longer have the numerical superiority that they enjoyed in 1941. And they no longer have the equipment superiority that they had in 1941. The tide has changed, and the Soviets now have better equipment and more troops, and they're able to put more men in the field. We can go about why that happened, blah, 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 but the point is that is what the narrative was. Well, apparently right from the day one, apparently, according to Nigel Esquet, the Soviets just sent bazillions of troops at you, and it turns out it is, in fact, possibly racist propaganda, Nazi propaganda. And I agree. I think it is. I think it is. Basically, what I'm saying is this doesn't make any sense. The old narrative doesn't make any sense. It would have to have been literally millions more troops on the field of battle for the Soviet side in order for this narrative to actually make any sense. And not only that, you also have Soviet accounts saying the same thing. You got Red Army accounts saying we mowed down Germans. And the Germans are saying, we mowed down the Soviets. And when you actually look at it, like I think this was one of the things in the Stalingrad campaign so far. When you actually look at it, neither side had mowed down anybody. It's like, oh yeah, we took out a few tanks, we mowed them down. It's not, they're just making it up. And yeah, they're boasting. Both sides are we took out bazillions of our enemy. And in reality, they didn't. What's happened is, because of the Cold War, and because of Franz Halder and so on and so forth, the Germans were able to get their narrative out first, going, look how amazing we were, right? Or the Nazis, shall we say, got their agenda out first, their narrative, and then the Red Army wasn't able to, or the West didn't really care about the Red Army's accounts, so they just dismissed it. So it's like, oh, well, look, they wiped out millions of Red Army troops because that's what the Germans told them. Well, reality is they didn't. Not to that extent, anyway. So, I'm quite glad that this has been brought up because, I'd be interested to hear what Nigel Esquet has to say about this. Oh, no. So, number 6. It was the Arctic cold that halted the German offensive. It was oil. Mostly. Much of the Western historiography on Operation Barbarossa, based in the main on German sources, emphasized the murderous freezing temperatures and cite them as a dominant reason for the German defeat. But this is not borne out by meteorological data. The Soviet counteroffensive coincided with an unusual temperature drop to below minus 35 degrees Celsius on the 5th and 6th of December. But in fact, the Germans were able to ward off the Soviet attacks during these incredibly low temperature days. On the 6th of December, in a record minus 38 degrees below zero, German 9th Army counterattacked at Kalinin with fire support from Panzer Group 3, tank corps basically, and pushed back the Soviet 31st Army across the Volga River again. In the process, Soviet 205th Rifle Division was completely routed and had to be withdrawn from combat. So during the freezing cold weather, the Germans were still effective. Between the 5th and 7th of December, the German High Command reported that the Soviet attacks in general were warded off. We failed during the first days, admitted Zhukov, the most acclaimed Soviet military commander of the Second World War. But on 8th of December, a low-pressure ridge that brought thaw and heavy downfalls covered the Moscow region. The entries of the German High Command's diary show that this weather would continue to hold the area in its grip for several days. On the 8th of December, the German High Command's diary noted sudden weather change, temperatures during day up to +4 degrees Celsius, soft roads. Interestingly, it was on that day that the Soviet troops achieved the first real breakthroughs. On the same day, General Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, the commander of German Army Group Center, desperately reported that his troops were in no position to withstand the Soviet counterattack. On the 9th of December, with temperatures ranging between -5 and 0 degrees, so not -38, von Bock sent an urgent request to the Army High Command. The Army Group needs more men. A deeply concerned General Oberst Franz Halder at the Army High Command wrote in his diary, phone talk with Field Marshal von Bock, General Guderian reports that the condition of his troops is so critical that he does not know how to fend off the enemy. In rain and thaw on the 12th of December, German 2nd Panzer Division was ousted from that place, having been pushed back 40 kilometers since the Soviet counteroffensive began. That day, an increasingly desperate von Bock phoned the OKH, German High Command, Army High Command, again reporting that the situation for Army Group Center had reached an acutely critical stage. The Southwestern Front's preparation in 2nd Army's front was further deepened through Livny in the direction of Orel. The 45th Infantry Division was encircled and partly destroyed. Very serious situation in 2nd Army, Halder noted in his diary. So the thaw, so when the temperatures actually increased, was when the Soviets did really well, which is opposite to what we would normally hear. Indeed, the turning point on Moscow is a most peculiar event. In fact, the German troops, who had believed that their enemy was on the verge of collapsing, were psychologically totally unprepared for such a violent onslaught by highly motivated Red Army soldiers. They began to fall back, and soon the withdrawal turned to a flight, and this is where Hitler's stand-fast order comes in. They were beginning to collapse, and it's like, no, stand. And so, yeah, this is where the narrative now is, well, he might have been wrong in the future battles where he said stand fast and then got encircled. Although, Ian, if you watch my Kurland series, you'll see that actually that didn't happen quite the way that the narrative has been portrayed. But let's just say it did. Well, now it's like, well, actually he was correct to order the army to stand fast in 1941. So, again, but a mass psychosis had gripped the Wehrmacht soldiers. This fueled combat spirits on the Soviet side even further. Yeah. In many places, the battle developed into Red Army troops drunk with success and eager for revenge, pursuing scattered Wehrmacht formations fleeing along the icy roads. It was a collapse in morale on the German side, nothing less. Serious break of confidence in the field commands was noted on the German side. I agree with this. But I think it's interesting, you know, the narrative has literally been changed the other way around. It's like literally flipped on its head. And I guess, and I'm going to say, that Franz Halder was probably behind this, and also Nazi propaganda. At this point, I wasn't able to verify, so we'll see what happens with this one. But the Soviet Partisans, point 8. The history of the Soviet Partisans is to a large degree clouded by extremely biased German reports and a glorification of Soviet official historiography, what historians wrote. In his famous radio broadcast speech on the 3rd of July 1941, Joseph Stalin, urged the population to form guerrilla units in the areas occupied by the enemy. However, in reality, Stalin and the Soviet leadership feared individual initiative beyond their own control, because they're socialists, more than anything else, right? And during the first 15 months of the war, actual Soviet policy discounted and even discouraged popular initiative and participation. If you can't control it, it's not socialism, right? So individual initiative, free market, right? I know it's not in economics terms, but it's the same principle, right? This is why Hitler was against Auftragstaktik, tactic, and he wanted complete control by the end of the war. The reason why is because he doesn't want individual initiative, because socialists believe that the state, the hierarchy of society, is better organized and blah, 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 right? That's the reason why. So again, oh no, Stalin does not want the individual, right, the private citizen, committing, you know, his own, taking things into his own initiative. That's wrong, because the socialists want the state hierarchy, right? So it does make sense. The National Directives for Partisan Activity, issued on the 18th of July 1941, stated that partisan members were to include only participants in the Civil War and those comrades who had already shown their worth in the destruction battalions, NKVD, the secret police, and state security organizations sabotage units, the police, People's Militia, and also workers from the NKVD. In fact, the main task assigned by the Soviet leadership to the partisans was not so much to fight the occupants, but to carry out the political tasks assigned to them, i.e., to reinstate and uphold the authority of the Soviet government in the occupied territories. In the first years, most people killed by the partisans were Soviet citizens accused of being opposed to the Soviet system. Gotta have that totalitarian control. Only in 1943 did the partisan movement begin to become a military force to count on, which is why you start hearing of the partisans more in 1943, so yay. The last one I'm going to have to censor because of YouTube, and people get triggered if I use a naughty word, apparently. The unknown wave of mass socialization on the Eastern Front. Western writers have been quite successful in establishing the terrible wave of mass socialization committed by Soviet soldiers in Germany and Poland towards the end of the war as a general public knowledge. For instance, in his epic book on the Battle of Berlin, good book, historian Anthony Beaver deals with the mass socialization of Germans or Polish women by Soviet soldiers on 28 different pages. When dealing with mass socialization, the victim's perspective must, of course, dominate, absolutely, and thus it is absolutely justified and a moral obligation to deal with these atrocities, absolutely. What makes the whole matter even more tragic is that German socialization of Polish and Soviet women, probably on an even larger scale, and definitely preceding these Soviet socializations, are ignored by nearly all Western historians. Although probably millions of Soviet citizens, primarily women and girls, became socialization victims, the topic has been grossly understudied. There is also a widespread myth that Jews were not victims of the Germans in this situation. Evidence from all over Europe, including the occupied territories and the concentration camps, prove that this is not true. The Nazi laws against having relations with a Jewish woman only pertained in cases of consensual relations. Yeah. Even in spite of their official military and racial laws and rules, Germans of the Wehrmacht, the police, the SS, the civil administration and their allies engaged in mass socialization, including gang socialization on an enormous and routine scale, in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union and Poland, and elsewhere, but mostly in the East. The victims were Jews as well as Gentiles, women and girls as well as men and boys, and victims were from the youngest of ages. There are examples of 90-year-old female socialization victims as well as 9 and 8-year-old girls. Yeah. But stick to tanks, right? Is the advice that I get all the time. No. Christer Bergström is the author of Operation Barbarossa, 1941, Hitler against Stalin. His previous work includes the Ardennes, 1944 and 1945, Hitler's Winter Offensive, and the Battle of Berlin, an epic conflict revisited. And this was published in June of 2016, which I think was actually before my videos on the numbers. But yeah, I pretty much agree. I mean, I can't verify the spy one. And to be fair, I haven't actually looked into the Soviet partisan one, personally, or technically much of this one. But I don't disagree with what he said in that, because it did happen. There are accounts. And what he said here makes a lot of sense. And the what was the other one? The second one, wasn't it? No, the third one. The spy one, I can confirm that the Soviet Far East armies didn't go to Moscow. So, yeah. What the spy said, I'm not sure, but the rest of it. But yeah, I agree with all these. And I like the fact that it backs up what I have been saying. So again, let's see what Nigel Askey has to say about this. If he responds, I haven't responded to him. I mean, as I say, priorities. Got to have the priorities. And people claiming that the Germans were amazing and took out and mowed down. You know, what was the quote? The German divisions were rocks drowning under a sea of Soviet rifles and tanks. That was one of the generals said that. I'm paraphrasing, but that's exactly what he said. It's like, no, no, come on. So yeah. Let me know what you guys think. I'd be interested to hear what you guys thought of this, because this literally goes against what the Wehrmacht, Wehraboos, and the Nazis usually say. So I'll be interested to hear what you guys say about this. But I'm glad that Mr. Nord brought this up, because I found a historian who actually agrees with most of those points at least, and I agree with him. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye for now.